Center of Urban History is one of the 3 partners in the AIPRIL platform, an interdisciplinary platform on inequality, which brings together historians, people with a background in social policy, development studies, economists, and so on, all studying inequality. And we are very honored today to welcome Professor Walter Scheidel from Stanford University as our speaker. Walter Scheidel is best known also to people from outside the academic world for 2 recent highly influential books. The Great Leveler, on the one hand, you see it here on the screen, basically arguing that only violence and massive disruption can ever significantly reduce inequality. And on the other hand, more recent, The Escape from Rome, which demonstrates how empires and large political states configurations for a long time obstructed durable economic development and growth. And one might forget that Walter Scheidel, first and foremost, is also one of the most distinguished specialists of Roman economic history. He's a prolific author who has edited, authored, co-authored many of the recent syntheses in the field, often from a comparative perspective and also with an open eye to the natural sciences, joining natural, social sciences with history and the humanities. But for AIPRIL, it was The Great Leveler which directly inspired our research program here in Antwerp, because we basically wanted to know if there really were no benign mechanisms able to reduce inequality in a sort of sustainable way. That's what we want to do with our AIPRIL research program, questioning, so to speak, whether there really is no alternative to the Great Leveler as violence and massive disruption. However, today, Walter Scheidel will talk about his new research, which is about inequality and institutions, yes, but more specifically also on the role of technology and technological change. Please, during the presentation, ask your questions in the chat. Afterwards, we will have a Q&A, and we will, based on the questions in the chat, we will invite people to ask their questions directly to Walter to have a more sort of kind of informal discussion. Walter, you have the floor. Many thanks for joining us today in this seminar.
Well, thanks a lot, Tim, for this kind introduction and the invitation. I'm very happy to be with you. I hope this will not be a major disappointment, because you always get invited after you write a big book and then you have to talk about the same things and they may not have anything interesting to say anymore, but I'll try my best. And if you hear any funny sounds during my presentation, people next door just started drilling holes into the wall. So I hope this won't interfere with my presentation. I don't actually have PowerPoint slides because I've been watching too many people sharing their screens over the last year or so. So I'm going to be very low tech. I want to explain very briefly the title of my paper, which of course is a reference to Jan Tinbergen's concept of the race between education and technology, which I guess doesn't need any introduction in this forum, but just in a nutshell, the idea is that as technology changes as an ongoing process over time, it will increase the demand for certain skills, and people who have these skills might benefit disproportionately, increasing inequality unless the supply of education, of training, of human capital keeps up with that technological change. Now, my paper is not about a race, though. It's about something better, maybe described as a dance, even though it's probably not an ideal metaphor either, between technological change on the one hand and different forms of social power on the other over the long run of history. Now, I should explain how I came to this. It was prompted by an assignment by Sir Angus Deaton, who has convened a group of people doing similar things to what Tim just described, working on various aspects of inequality. And my job in this is to respond to a paper by Bob Allen, the economist, economic historian, well known for his work on real wages, the Industrial Revolution, many other things, on the drivers of inequality in first the UK and the US over the last 400 years. And Bovell in his account focuses very much on the interplay of wages and technological change. It's a story driven very much by technology, by technological changes in a driver's seat. And you see inequality outcomes respond to those shifts. In some periods, productivity and wages went up concurrently, and inequality did not go up as a result. And in other periods, the growth of wages would lag behind productivity growth, and it would generate higher profits for investors, higher returns on capital, and inequality would go up. So that's a very specific perspective, and my job is, with regard to that perspective, to broaden this in two ways. One is by expanding this view over the very long run of history, and then of course by considering other determinants, other factors influencing the distribution of material resources. Now, we today, of course, thanks to the advent of modern science and technology, are likely to think of technological change as a predominantly modern kind of phenomenon, a powerful force acting on labor markets, on earning opportunities, and on inequality. But it's important to realize or remember that the impact of technology on inequality has in fact a much longer pedigree. It stretches back at the very least into the early stages of the Holocene, if not before that. And the reason, of course, is that if you look at foraging communities or even horticultural, simple agrarian societies, they are not generally able to sustain high levels of inequality that only comes in with small-scale agricultural and pastoralist societies, because of changes in the mode of production, in the institutions that govern property rights, and the vertical transmission, the intergenerational transmission of material assets. The short version of this being that once you transition to mature farming and herding, it becomes possible to accumulate material resources and to establish claims to material resources in ways that would be alien to hunter-gatherers or to horticulturalists, and then, of course, also ensure that these assets are passed on to close relatives, and so build up inequality over time. Now, this is well known, of course. The question is, what role did technology play in that process? And it depends very much on how you define technology. If you define it very broadly as the mode of production, then of course technology was all important. If you shift from foraging to food production. If you define technology more narrowly in terms of the creation of sort of physical technology, of gadgets, we might suspect maybe it didn't play such a big role compared to the more recent past, but it doesn't actually seem to be the case. There's a study that came out a couple of years ago by a team convened by Sam Bowes, arguing that the introduction of plows in particular played a really major role, something that occurs only in mature farming regimes that starts about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago in some parts of the world. The argument being that once you employ plows and similar machinery on a large scale, inequality is going to go up. And the underlying argument, of course, is that if you're a horticulturalist, you engage in garden farming, you're going to use very simple, lightweight, handheld tools. It means that farm work is labor intensive and what they call labor limited, in the sense that output is really a function of the number of people participating in the process. It's not so much access to land. If you gave more land to such people, they wouldn't necessarily be able to produce more because they're held back by the fact they have to work with their own hands in order to cultivate the land. Once you introduce plows, the system becomes more land limited. You can add more land and put that land under cultivation with the help of plows and domesticated draft animals. And that would raise the value of land relative to the value of labor and arguably sustain greater inequality over time. Now, the question is, how does that shift occur? The short answer is we don't really know because it happened a really long time ago. they come up with a parsimonious model in a way that there had always been inequality up to a point, even in earlier regimes, and that would have probably enabled some people to adopt plow farming early, to acquire plows, draft animals, whereas others did not. And for those people, land would be of higher value than labor. So it was in their interest to acquire more land from people for whom land was of lesser value. And once that process got started, you would see increasing and self-sustaining, self-perpetuating inequalities, with the increasingly landless people being downgraded in terms of their status. They might end up being tenants or bondsmen or clients or whatever of the landowners. And then over time, with intergenerational transmission of wealth, inequality would go up in overall, and would be reinforced by concurrent inequalities in terms of status, legal status, and political power. That in turn meshes well with the finding of another recent survey by Tim Kohler and his associates, comparing proxy metrics for economic inequality in the old world, in Afro-Eurasia, and in the new world, in the Americas. What they find is that on average, levels of material inequality in the pre-modern, in the ancient old world was significantly higher than in the pre-conquest Americas, measured by looking at the dispersion of house sizes, because that's something we can easily look at in different pre-literate societies. There's a lot of archaeological evidence for that. The more dispersed house sizes are in a given society, the higher inequality we assume was at the time. Now, they argue that the systematic difference between old world and new world inequality was driven ultimately by technology. It was a technology-driven process of disequalization, driven by the use of animal power in food production, which was much more common in the old world because there were larger animals to be domesticated, whereas people in the new world had to work essentially mostly with their hands, and also the use of domesticated horses and camels in military operations. So domesticating large animals would support plow agriculture and thereby higher levels of inequality, but it will also increase the coercive capabilities of elites through cavalry warfare, and that in turn would shore up inequality as well. So it seems that for millennia, technology has actually been critical in determining overall levels of inequality, which is perhaps a bit of an unexpected finding if you come out of that tradition, because that's not something that historians of pre-modern societies would ordinarily have expected or argued. At the same time, of course, there are plenty of institutions that in a way mimic the disequalizing effects of technology in such environments, but they are not actually technological phenomena. If we go to horticultural societies, I say they are usually less unequal because of the absence of plows. Well, they're also in many cases, if you think of West Africa in particular, highly polygynous, because a lot of the work is done by women without the help of plows. The more women are attached to a particular household, the more that household is going to produce, the wealthier this household is going to be, the more women will be attracted one way or another to that household. And again, inequality is generated and grows and is sustained over time. So if you forgive me the analogy, in this case, women in a way functionally play the role of the oxen in plow farming, in the sense that they provide a means of increasing inequality in other ways. It's a substitution of certain forms of human labor for technological change. Same, of course, is true of slave labor, which is an institution that typically tries to turn human beings into something closer to machines or robots in a way that can be exploited more ruthlessly. An idea we already see expressly in the ancient Greek tradition, where Aristotle says famously, or rather notoriously, that the slave is a living machine, an organon empsikon, a tool with a soul. A slave is a living tool, just as a tool is an inanimate slave. There's a clear sort of substitution concept going on here already in the 4th century BC in Aristotle's Nicomean ethics. The idea being, even though slaves are not physical technology that can be employed in ways that would mimic the introduction of more productive technology. And of course, slavery, this is well known, drives up inequality all by itself by inflating elite wealth, because the labor embodied in workers is counted as the property of the owner of the slave. So in the southern US, for instance, half of all private wealth before the Civil War was embodied in Black slaves, and slave states were much more unequal than other states in the Union. Feudalism, other forms of bondage, that's another mechanism. That's something I talk about in my Leveler book, of course. A famous example is how different societies would respond to labor shortages created by the Black Death. We have similar levels of demographic attrition in different societies, but the response of what we would now call employers differs depending on the institutional setup. If you live in Northwestern Europe, price-setting labor markets become more dominant, feudal restraints fall by the wayside, real incomes of workers go up. There would have been the option in theory to substitute technology for the workers who had died in the plague. There has been a lot of discussion about to what extent this actually happened in that period. It sometimes seems overrated. There is technological progress, but it's not really that striking. It's not actually right in this period. So in the absence of the substitution of machines or other forms of technological innovation for the missing laborers, well, the standing of laborers goes up and they are better off than before. The alternative, of course, is to crack down on labor, to tighten the reins, like was set in serfdom in Central and Eastern Europe, where the elites would collude to keep the workers in their place and make sure they would pay the same rents as before and work for the same low wages. And we have the same in Mamluk Egypt. We have the same situation in Spanish Mexico in the 16th century, where there's a huge die-off of the population because of the pandemics unleashed by European pathogens. And that goes on for a while. And then when labor markets become, the restraints in labor markets become more relaxed, real wages go up as well. So the conclusion is, across world history, it's a very common experience that, of course, exploitative institutions, violent coercions play a major role in determining wages and inequality, regardless of technology. So it's not necessary, it wasn't necessary to introduce new technology to increase inequality, but at the same time, it certainly was a factor. So you have a combination of both of these things pushing in the same direction. Now you could say that was in the distant past. What has happened in more recent history, in the 20th century in particular, to my mind, it's a very similar kind of situation. Going back one more time to education, since I brought up the Tinbergen concept of the race between education and technology. Education is not an autonomous factor in this. Access to education has always been and will always be mediated by politics, by political relations determining what kind of schooling is available to which people, how much it costs, and so on. So in that sense, education is just an epiphenomenon, or the supply of education is an epiphenomenon of something else. Returns on education are, of course, to some extent determined by the relationship between the supply of education and technological change, but also significantly by exogenous shocks. This accounts for the fact, as again I say in my book, that skill premiums in the US, for instance, collapsed exactly during and after World War I and during World War II, but not at any other time in the 20th century. And you see a lesser effect again in the US during the Vietnam War, where more people went to college to avoid the draft, and with a certain lag effect that would lower returns on college degrees 5 or 10 years down the line. So these are things that have nothing to do with technology per se. Labor unions are also an interesting variable in all of this, a determinant of actual inequality outcomes, especially in terms of wage inequality. Now, obviously, the strength of labor unions, of organized labor, is very much determined by technological change. You rely on urbanization, industrialization, factory mode of production to build up strong unions. But at the same time, union power is also shaped very massively in many countries by, again, exogenous shocks. That's why union density went up in the wake of World War I, in the wake of World War II, and in the US during the New Deal because of special legislation. It's driven significantly by mass mobilization warfare that mobilizes men, at least not just as soldiers, but also as workers. But then, of course, mass mobilization warfare itself relies critically on technological change. You're not going to have industrial scale, industrialized warfare without preceding technological change. So these things are inextricably intertwined and entangled. And the same entanglement can be observed more recently as union power in many countries, especially Anglo countries, diminished. That again occurred because of a combination of technological change, the shift to the service sector, deindustrialization, and so on, but also political shifts in terms of deregulation, liberalization, globalization. And they both converge in weakening union powers. You can't easily separate them. Same is true of globalization, which, just like union power, relies critically on technological change, going back to the late 19th century with steamships and refrigeration, and then information technology, all the things that make globalization possible on a large scale. But it's also driven by political incentives and disincentives in terms of barriers to trade and flows of capital and any number of things. Had it not been, globalization would have continued in an uninterrupted fashion from the 1870s onwards all the way to the present. And we know that was not the case because of the world wars and all kinds of policies in the 20s, 30s, 40s, protectionism, and so on. So again, you can't really separate those factors in any satisfactory way. There's also the element of how politics as such determines how technological change affects inequality. To give just two extreme examples, if you think of Russia in the late Tsarist period, you had rapid industrialization, inequality was going up as a result. And then, of course, under the Soviet Union, industrialization continued, reached an even higher level, but inequality was much lower because of the political regime that had been put in place. A more sort of moderate case would be Japan, where you have rapid industrialization in the decades leading up to World War II, with immense elite enrichment, explosive growth in inequality, and then a continuing industrialization after World War II with the opposite outcome in terms of income inequality because of loss of elite power, lower returns on capital, stronger unions, pre-distributive measures that governs the payout of the gains from this process. And then, of course, last but not least, technological change itself is mediated by political preference. We can trace this back we can probably trace it back to antiquity, but more confidently to the Middle Ages. There are studies of the adoption of things like windmills, water mills in Northwestern Europe and in the Middle East in the High Middle Ages. And it turns out they were much more popular in certain European societies, probably because property rights could be better guaranteed than in the Middle Eastern settings. If you think of the stance of British Parliament a couple hundred years ago, when machine technology really showed up on a large scale for the first time, that the members of Parliament would consistently side with the industrialists, the innovators, over people who resisted the introduction of these machines, the Luddites and all these various opponents. And that would, of course, reinforce this process. You have state-sponsored industrialization during the Meiji period in Japan, whereas colonized countries in the same period experienced restraints on industrialization imposed by colonial rule. So again, we can't really disentangle all these things. Technology has always been so strongly mediated by other factors that we can't really expect a clear connection to emerge between technological change on the one hand and inequality outcomes on the other. Now that poses potentially a problem for the kind of story that, say, Robert Allen is trying to tell in this forthcoming study. So what he does is he distinguishes between four phases of development over the last 400 years, the first two mostly in the UK, the last two in the US as being sort of the leading Western economies in that period. In phase number one, from the early 17th to the late 18th century, you see a shift from farm labor to manufacturing in the UK, but also high real wages, which is something indicative that inequality was not actually going up, although at the same time there are indications that the share of labor in overall GDP went down, which is usually an indication that inequality was going up. So there's no clear trend, which in a way sort of more or less fits the prediction that at least inequality did not significantly go up in that period. It wasn't such a bad period for labor. Then, of course, phase two is the Industrial Revolution from the late 18th century to like into the third quarter, let's say, of the 19th century in the UK, which was bad for workers. You have increases in GDP, but not much rise initially in wage income, what Bob Allen calls Engels' pause. Again, it's not quite clear to what extent inequality overall went up in the UK. We know that wealth inequality went up throughout this period, but it was driven by the valuation of land. The people benefiting were actually mostly large landowners and not so much the industrialists. So it's not quite clear how this is connected to the process of industrialization, at best in a more indirect fashion. The process is more clearly documented in the US, where inequality in all domains, income, wealth, does go up with early and maturing industrialization. So that's, again, a reasonably good fit between the expectation and the observed outcomes. That's no longer the case in phase number three, what Allen calls the age of manufacturing, focusing in the US from the 1860s after the Civil War into the 1970s, where labor, he claims, made gains quite consistently, but there's no coherent trend. Up to the 1920s, inequality in the US actually went up to extremely high levels and only contracted during the Great Depression, New Deal, and World War II. And you see similar trajectories in other countries. And it's clear, or at least I think it's clear, that the main drivers behind this is not so much technology per se, but war, politics, unionization, curbs on immigration in the case of the US, and so on. So it's very difficult to tell a coherent story for that century plus that relies mostly or predominantly on technological change. This changes again once you reach phase number four, what he calls the service revolution from the 70s onwards, where you have new technology, IT, automation, a relative decline of manufacturing, expansion of the service sector, generating higher corporate profits, and more inequality because service sector wages tend to be very uneven. Now, again, this is clearly driven by technological change to some extent, but also, of course, by politics. It had to be possible to outsource, to do all kinds of things having to do with globalization in particular. And it's not a given empirically that service sector wages have to be so unequal as they are in some Anglo countries and in the US in particular. That's a much more recent phenomenon starting in the 1980s. And again, there's an ongoing debate among economists about why exactly this is. Was it just in response to market incentives? Or it is a kind of form of almost corruption of rent-taking, a seeking behavior by executives colluding with compliant boards to, ratchet up their compensation. You have knock-on effects in other sectors. It's a seemingly endless debate. I had to look at all of this when I wrote the book, and it's still not really properly resolved as far as I can tell. But there is no doubt that power, political, social power, played a major role in the changes that we have observed over the last 40 years or so. So essentially, we have to fall back on the old story that goes back to thousands of years ago. Technology does change. It is tempting to blame changes in inequality, especially rising inequality, just or primarily on technological change. But power relations are always critical. They have always been, and they are critical now. Now, this is something that Thomas Piketty, of course, famously stressed. This is my one visual aid, his massive tome from 2020, where he says, and I quote, "Inequality is neither economic nor technological. It is ideological and political. Now, that's a very strong statement. It's a very absolute statement. It does fit the spirit of our times because we have seen a shift in economics in particular, away from just looking at technology and market forces to power relations in determining actual levels of inequality. And that's a good thing. But whenever the pendulum swings in a certain direction, there's always a risk that it swings a little too far. And I think the Piketty quote is a good illustration of this, because it is demonstrably true that inequality is also meaningfully driven by technology per se. Thousands of years ago, it was easier to maintain higher inequality if you had access to plows, all other things being equal, and if you didn't have access to plows. And today, it is easier for inequality to be high if the service sector is dominant. It would have been less easy 50 years ago with the large unionized factory system. Technology creates options that would not otherwise exist. It's not just a function of political relations. Landowners have to have the option to use plows and draft animals for inequality to go up. Capitalists have to have the option to substitute machine labor for human labor, something they weren't quite able to do in the late Middle Ages, when they probably would have liked to, but they couldn't do it because the technology wasn't available and couldn't be created on a reasonable scale or time scale. But it could be created in your Lancashire capitalism in England, or now thanks to IT and artificial intelligence. So in that sense, technology does play an autonomous role, or at least it seems to me that it does, in a way that meaningfully separates it from institutions, politics, and power. It is the application of technology that is mediated by institutions and politics and power. And it is above all the effects, the inequality effects of technological change that are mediated by institutions, politics, and power. So that is not true in the same way of education, where, as I said, the supply of education is always invariably mediated by institutions and technology, institutions, politics, and power. So technology is more autonomous in that sense. In the end, I think there is not a race between education and technology per se, given that education is to some extent a symbol of power relations. There is a never-ending dance between technology, which enjoys a certain degree of autonomy, and political and social power relations, which means that scholars who focus primarily on skill-biased technological change are sort of blinded on one eye, so to speak. But so is someone like Piketty, because it's just not true that inequality isn't at all political, isn't at all technological. It is not just political and ideological, it is also driven by technology. Now, this may sound banal, but if you look at the actual literature, you find that people quite consistently tend to prioritize particular factors. So in economics, technology used to play a more dominant role, and now power relations have sort of caught up in the discourse. And in a sort of mirror image of this, if you looked at pre-modern history, historians would always privilege power relations. And now they're beginning to wake up to the fact that technology actually also played an autonomous role in creating and sustaining inequality, even in the very distant past. It's a constant back and forth in terms of academic perspectives. What we haven't yet figured out is what the right template is to relate technological change and social political power in studying the dynamics of inequality. We don't really have a sort of sophisticated model for doing this, not for the present, not for the past, and not for the future. And that matters given the current debate about the likely outcomes of ongoing automation, artificial intelligence. Some people claiming it's going to hollow out labor markets, inequality is going to go through the roof, and other people based on the same data or predictions say that's not going to happen, right? And that's ultimately because we haven't really quite figured out how to relate those two fundamental features, technological change on the one hand, and what we might call power on the other. But it seems to me those are the two poles around which we ought to organize the study of inequality, both in the past and in the present. And I may well be wrong about this, so I'm very much looking forward to your questions and comments in discussion. But thanks for listening to me so far.
Thank you very much, Walter, for guiding us through world history, for this reflection on technology, how it shapes inequality, and whether or not it's just mediated by institutions and politics or shaped by, is technology always shaped by institutions and power relations. I think there are a lot of people here who are working on social power and how it shapes inequality. So I'm looking forward to the questions. You can ask them through the chat, but you can later also just raise your hands. But first of all, thanks again, Walter, for this very stimulating presentation. I have one question on the chat already. Sam, do you want to explain this? Sam Grinsell? You're unmuted.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm unmuted, okay. Thank you for a really stimulating presentation. You mentioned globalization in passing. I wonder if you might have some more to say about how globalization in the contemporary world or in the past empire and colonialism have redistributed inequalities. For example, you know, if a society, the level of inequality in France or England in, say, 1890 is obviously deeply related to a global network of inequality. I just wonder whether you'd think with us through how we might account for that, which is of course technological as well in a way. Empire itself was a technology. So
It very much is, right? I mean, that's a good example of a development that is in a meaningful way driven by technology that makes it possible for certain European countries to go out into the world and hit other people over the head and establish colonies and exploit them and do all the horrible things that they did, in the process helping create, I should say, international inequalities that did not previously exist, or if they existed on a very small scale. It's not that GDP was always exactly the same in per capita terms in different parts of the globe, but the differences were nothing like what you see from the 19th century onwards. And as a result, again, there's a very intense entanglement, right? If you have certain technologies of production in Europe, that pulls Europe forward, so to speak, but you also have technologies of oppression, so to speak, in the colonized territories that hold the colonized societies back, and at the same time promote, you know, wealth and growth in the colonizing ones. So, and again, this is completely, intertwined with political relations, right? In that you could have a not very plausible but theoretical counterfactual where the societies of Europe would have decided to proceed differently, right? They were not likely to proceed differently historically, but in theory they could have, right? So you could construct a counterfactual where the technology was shared more evenly or something else would have happened, right? So you are absolutely right. And it shows you just how big the story is, right? And that we can't really, and this is a tendency, I mean, I don't generalize too much, but if you look at the evils of colonialism, there is a tendency of sort of privileging, I think, social political power and ideology and these kinds of things. And it's important to also always stress the technological dimension of this, which isn't really separable, right, from that. It's not just what people wanted to do, but also what they were able to do, right? And it's difficult to disentangle this empirically. So yes, absolutely. Ideally, we would always write total histories of inequality in that sense, which sounds good on paper. It's very difficult to do in practice, right? Especially if you don't, if you want to do case studies and so on. But I think that should be our ultimate goal, or at least the goal should be that all the specialized studies should ultimately add up to a total history of inequality that takes account of within society, between society inequalities, and the different driving forces.
Thank you. Any other questions? I think you can also raise hands, but I always have to look where this raise hand button. It's in the chat normally, or in the participants view. Anyway, Yves answers that he has a question. Yves Marx.
Thanks, Tim. Hope everybody can hear me. I was just wondering, I mean, would you know of any kind of particularly illuminating studies that look at how the kind of introduction of proliferation of certain technologies, how those worked out in a different way in different institutional settings? I was kind of thinking, because you mentioned the case of communism in Russia, whereas industrialization was on. And so I would think that the one effect was that it kind of stifled innovation or the impact of technology. So I was kind of thinking, like are there particularly interesting studies there?
I don't know. I mean, that's an excellent question, and I would find it hard to believe that they don't exist. It's just that I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I must admit, I just sort of started dealing with this, you know, a couple of months ago, and I haven't pursued it in detail. I'm not sure if I will continue to do that or not, but I mean, that is clearly rich material for such studies, but I couldn't tell you right now if they have actually been undertaken. I would like to know if anybody knows about them. I would like to know, because I can use them as ammunition in my you know, engagement with Bob Allen.
If anyone has suggestions or wants to continue this aspect, please mention it in the chat. In the meanwhile, there is another question by Henry Hapanala. Henry,
who is looking, sorry to interrupt him, looking exactly at this issue, at how the impact of robotization impacts on employment in different kind of institutional settings where unions are powerful and where there's a lot of collectively organized labor, as it were, as opposed to settings where unions are and unorganized labor is weaker. But,
yeah, definitely, yeah. And I think Belgium is doing pretty well in that respect, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of actual outcomes, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Henry, you want to continue this discussion?
Yeah, sure, why not, gladly. I mean, this is what my PhD research is about as well, so I'm really kind of happy to drop in the middle of the conversation here. But yeah, like I just wrote a question or a comment about like Carl Benedict Frey's book, The Technological Trap, from 2019, which is really talking about, you know, similar things also from a broad historical context, how, you know, technology and politics kind of interrelate. And he makes, you know, the example of the British government and how they kind of approached the Luddite protests. And when they made the decision, we need to, you know, side with the industrialists and side with the machines, because they kind of saw that in the long term, you know, technologies would have the potential to create more jobs and more welfare and more growth and, you know, more positive outcomes for society, even if at that time it would, you know, imply the loss of, you know, multiple industrial jobs and, you know, just, you know, changing livelihoods in a way. Because like as he says as well, kind of, you know, in the short run, you might have, you know, bad consequences for people who are working in these industries, but the short run can be a lifetime for some individuals. So it's really, you know, a long-term kind of trade-off that we are talking about. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of the historical example, I think. And like today, you know, if you are looking at, you know, robotics or artificial intelligence or ICT, they really seem like, you know, similar sorts of kind of technologies, in the sense that if you believe some of the more kind of broad estimates of how many jobs could be destroyed by, you know, technology or, you know, ICT or automation or those kinds of things, the number of jobs and the kind of quantity of jobs can be just massive. And it can be, you know, jobs that are, you know, kind of holding up multiple families, you know, some that require low education or medium education or so on. So is it sort of a politically feasible choice for countries to go fully on board with automation and this new technology, even if that meant that at this moment it would, you know, come at a massive cost to livelihoods for many individuals from, you know, from these kind of more difficult backgrounds in a way, or those who don't have education or don't have potential for education. So, you know, it can kind of increase inequality today, even if the potential or kind of the reward is that, you know, in 30 or 40 years time, just get more, more productivity and more growth for the entire economy.
Right. It's an interesting question. I mean, I hope there's no expert on British history in the audience, because I'm going out on a limb here. This is all secondhand. But as I understand it from my readings, is the British government or parliament's decisions were driven by three factors, right? One is the culture of improvement. The idea being that, everything is getting better if we innovate and all the rest of it, what you said. The second one is, how do we beat the French? And so, having machines and more output was helpful too. And the third one, who is going to essentially bribe us or, persuade us to pass certain bills and not others? It wasn't going to be the Luddites. It was going to be, rich people. So there's an interesting entanglement of interest in the public good, broadly defined, and the more self-serving interests of political elites. And I think that's not something that's limited to, Britain a couple hundred years ago. The same is true today. If you look at the US Congress in particular, it's a particularly extreme example, right? People are presumably interested in long-term benefits and growth perspectives and so on. They are worried not about beating the French, but about beating China at this point. And they are also interested in who is going to give them the most money for their re-election campaigns. And where's that money come from? Is it going to come from big tech firms? Is it going to come from labor? Right. So you have the same kind of entanglements, and that they will then in a way also co-determine the outcomes, right? To what extent is government going to embrace what is in the next industrial revolution by giving sort of free rein to technology, sort of the Andrew Yang perspective? We say tech is great, but we also have to do something. We buffer people, give them universal basic income, and that's the way it's going to work. Or whether it's some kind of other arrangement. And I think that's what I was getting at, right? That the actual inequality outcomes are going to be determined by how these different variables are going to interrelate and play out, and which concern is going to be more important. In terms of overall economic growth, of course, the standard argument is that if you obstruct this kind of economic technological development, you will eventually pay a long-term price, right? And I suspect the same is bound to be true in a way in this case too. Inequality may go up in the short term, as it did during Engels' pause, for instance. That would be the closest analogy. And then once the system has matured and generates so much largesse that people who are shut out can get at least universal basic income and all the rest of it, then maybe inequality is going to go down. As a result of this, it's just very difficult for regimes to sell this to people if they need to be, re-elected every 2 or 4 or 6 years, right? That's a bit of a problem. So again, it's very closely tied up with the political system, how it's funded, how short-term or long-term it is. And it would be much easier for, I think, the Politburo in Beijing to make those decisions in a sensible way than for any kind of Western democracy. But that's just my own hunch.
Okay. Maaike de Keyzer wants to come back on the autonomous role of technology on long-term evolutions of inequality. Maaike, can you explain?
Yes, I think I can. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I was mostly struck by your own question. What is the balance? What is the template between power relations and between technology? I have to confess, for me, as a pre-modern historian, indeed, I am guilty, and I have looked at power more often than technology. I have to completely agree with the fact that I have done that more. But so my question is, if I look at now a lot of the scholars that have said it, also including you a little bit in your book, that inequality is always rising. We can see inequality rising throughout history, and we can also see it rising in periods without economic growth, without real demographical tendencies going up, but also in periods of, let's say, technological standstill. So is technological change then, if we're thinking about that template, is it an accelerating factor, or can we really see it as a causal factor in itself? So I was thinking about that. How can we see that? Is it just something that accelerates these trends that are happening anyway, or is it in itself a causal factor?
I think that is the question. I have a really compelling answer, but I think that's the question that we should always pose and keep focused on in a way, right? Because yes, technological development as such is ongoing and autonomous and self-sustaining to some extent. And so you could, if you wanted to, give it at the primary role in a way, and you would see as everything else as sort of interacting with that overall trend. And since the trend has been around for a really long time, you can make a pretty strong argument that technological change is in fact like almost, I'm not gonna say a law of nature, but it's a really consistent, well-established trend, and everything is in a way reactive to it. So I guess if put on the spot, I would probably go with that ideal typically, but I'm not sure how helpful that is, because it also instills a sense of defeatism, right? Oh, we can't do anything about it anyway. But it shouldn't, because the responsiveness of politics and institutions and society is the critical mediating variable, right, in a way. So it's not about, well, should governments embrace IT or not? I think in a way that's not a very helpful kind of choice, because it's not a real choice. The question is, how should it respond to it? How should it buffer the consequences via education, via any number of measures to try? And this is the biggest problem, that whenever you have that innovation, the gains tend to accrue disproportionately to certain elements, right? And living in Silicon Valley, I can attest sort of firsthand. And the funny thing is that all the tech guys who make billions are always saying things like, well, technology is going to solve all the problems, including inequality, because it empowers people. It's amazing, because, you know, farmers in the third world can now check prices on their cell phones. And so it comes up, right? It's the favorite example, which, you know, is nice, but it doesn't really address the issues that we are dealing with, especially in developed countries. And yeah, we can see that it would increase people's capabilities in some ways, but it seems on balance, the disequalizing effect of this technology as it is being adopted is stronger than any kind of, you know, equalizing effects, at least as far as one can see. I think that's empirically quite true. So this progress is always in the future. Well, by definition, progress is always in the future, but to what extent it's realistic to just sit and wait for that to happen? That would really take us back to a new version of the Kuznets paradigm in a way, right? The idea being, you have enough economic growth, inequality will go up. Don't worry, it'll go down again if you just wait long enough. And that's sort of an updated version of that argument that we see a lot actually in the IT sector. So we should be skeptical about that.
That's very interesting. And you see on the chat that there are two questions who developed that further. Is technology particularly relevant for income inequality, or should we, perhaps if we broaden the definition to broader definition of inequality? But Darius and Quiza, can you ask your question? If that's possible.
No, I think I can actually address it anyway. Because,
please have a go, yeah.
And that's very important, because it's important there are many different kinds of inequality, right? And what I wrote about is strictly economic inequality, right? Income and wealth inequality. And that has to be separated from all the other inequalities out there, which have, of course, trended quite consistently in a different direction over time. There is a secular trend towards slowly, painfully, more equalization in terms of gender relations and any number of things, race, sexual orientation, you name it, right? There's even a very slow convergence in terms of international inequality, even in the economic domain. I mean, it's, you know, haphazard, and, you know, there are all kinds of issues with that. But, and if you think of in terms of inequality as, you know, access to information and so on, then certainly technological change equalizes, right? It levels the playing field in that respect, giving people access to information, empowering them in certain ways in participating in a conversation or in a discourse or in society in ways that weren't possible before. That's certainly true. It's just a fascinating thing, I think, about economic inequality is to be highly resilient, in the sense that all other kinds of inequalities can go a certain way, and economic inequality goes its own way. It's almost like strangely detached from all these forms of progress, if you want to call it that, that we have seen in other domains. So that's a very interesting phenomenon to my mind.
Darius, you want to follow up on that? Or we don't hear you.
Muted.
You are muted.
Aha.
It's okay now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. It's very interesting. I'm Darius. First of all, I was thinking about social and economic inequalities. There have been always social and economic inequalities, even before the essence of technology. But now I want to ask you why the technology can have positive or negative impact on inequality of income and inequality of capabilities or well-being. So always policymakers play like a game or on both. But my question is, which one do you think deserves the most attention from policymakers? The second question, as we know that from many years, we know that in every society we have inequalities. Do you think that inequality can disappear in our respective society? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, the first question is a good one because I can't decide that, right? I mean, it has to be decided collectively. What people, and that's a good question. I mean, to find out what people value most. If they were given a choice between, is it more important for you to reduce economic and say income inequality or inequalities in terms of 17 other things, what matters more to you? It would be interesting to see what the collective answer is. I mean, choices are not usually posed in this way because it's all obscured by, you know, other political discourses. But that's actually, in a way, that goes to the heart of the matter. It's not obvious that economic inequality is the most interesting or important form of inequality. By no means. There are probably other forms that are at least as important. And if we had to make a choice, and I guess sometimes you may have to make a choice because you can't attenuate all of them simultaneously, if accepting higher income inequality somehow has the effect of improving others at the same time, that would not be the end of the world as far as I'm concerned, right? But that's easy for me to say. But that's really a question that should be more clearly posed and phrased in the public domain, right? And people should, you know, make so-called experts should maybe do a better job sort of informing the public about this and getting politicians to be a little more honest about these things. The second one, I mean, reduction of inequality, any form of inequality should always be an objective. Whether it will ever succeed is a different story. Whether it's an objective that has to be pursued at all costs is another story. I don't think so, right? I mean, there may again be other concerns more important. What, for instance, I mean, this is a good question. You know, climate change. We say, well, you know, in order to succeed against climate change, maybe developing countries should slow down and pollute less. Well, that would maybe help save the earth, but it would keep people in poverty for longer. So you have a very disturbing trade-off here, and it's not at all clear what the correct or appropriate choice is. I mean, ideally, you would want to do all at once, but if that's not possible, where do your priorities lie? So I think that these are both very, very good questions. I don't have a real answer, but we should focus on those issues.
Thank you.
And when there are different forms of inequality, there are also different forms of technology, of course. And that's where Tom de Hert wants to ask a question about. Tom?
Yes, thank you, Walter Scheidel, for the interesting discussion on technology and inequality. But yeah, that's what I asked myself. I think the debate on technology is important in the sense that it has been used, or technology has been used as a kind of excuse to justify some types of inequality. Let's think about the vaccine, for example, against COVID-19 and the debate on patents and intellectual property rights. It's all justifying inequality. But then there is also technology which is, I think, merely redistributive. You mentioned colonization due to superior technology in naval warfare, I suppose. So that's really redistributive. So it's another type of technology. I would think.
That's again a good question. I mean, what I didn't, when I did the level up book, I looked at maybe 1,000 studies, and I never came across one that attempted to establish the kind of taxonomy that you were referring to. We would say, those are all the examples we know about of technological changes in the productive domain that would affect inequality in a particular way because of X, Y, and Z. And these are changes in coercive capabilities or whatever you want to call them, doing that. And I mentioned them side by side when I talked about the war horses and the plow, the draft animals. And, these things do occur side by side and they reinforce one another. But you're absolutely right. And I think there's a huge amount of work to be done. I don't know the entire literature, but I think I know enough about it to know this hasn't really been done systematically, as far as I can tell, especially over historical time. So that would seem to me to be a problem, a project very much pursuing in a way. So I entirely agree with you. Although it is, since you brought up, this is a good one, naval technology and so on, it's kind of the entanglement. Striking. I mean, it's difficult to make a proper steam engine in England unless you know how to make a really good cannon, because you need the same technology for the cylinders and so. So all these things are also productive, coercive technologies. You need underpinnings that in some cases are actually the same, and then you develop technology that go in very different directions. But that's just a side note.
Questions are still popping up, but we're almost running out of time. But I will just summarize the last two questions, because they basically, from Lukas Leitner and Vitaly Volkov, they basically ask whether we are at a breaking point in history, because the kind of technological revolution we see now is different from everything which precedes. It's global. It's so Lukas asks, is this indeed the case? It's disconnected from labor to a certain extent. And Vitaly asks, well, on the other hand, will it make inequalities between countries disappear because they are technologically unified in a way?
Yeah, well, I mean, the standard answer to the first question is we simply don't know the new jobs that will be created in a world where automation takes over and AI. Just as people 200 years ago could not imagine the jobs that have been created since, right? When everybody was a farmer and now 1 or 2% of the population are, nobody could have predicted this. It was simply impossible. And it's impossible for us today to predict what kinds of jobs will or will not be generated by the AI revolution by 2100. That puts us in a very tricky position, right? And I wouldn't believe any kind of prediction based on this fundamental uncertainty. We know historically it is possible for this breaking point to actually not occur, because all kinds of new things will show up that we can't even think of right now. Or it may be different, right? Because the past does not determine the future, right? It could be a different kind of outcome. And I'd be thoroughly agnostic on this. I really wouldn't know how to decide between those two scenarios. Certainly history doesn't help us a whole lot in this. And as for the convergence, I mean, that's obviously going on. Have you had Branko Milanovic? You probably had Branko, because Branko is on every forum on inequality. And that's what he talks about, right? The gradual convergence and so on. And I think that's in the very long term, that's what we are seeing as rich countries grow more slowly. They age, they have all kinds of issues. And other countries will, to various degrees, catch up, but maybe not quite catch up. I mean, it's a simple math problem, right? What percentage rates do you need in order to fully catch up? It takes a lot, as we see in the case of China, but it's not impossible. If you just look at Shanghai, it's not impossible at all to actually catch up. But can you generalize from this? It's going to happen across the globe. I don't know. It could, in theory, or maybe not, right? It's another one of these very big issues. Is there enough slack to sort of catch up from? I mean, yeah, so again, we don't know. Or are the asymmetries that were created a couple hundred years ago ultimately insuperable worldwide, that some parts of the world can catch up, but not everyone? That is very much an open question. So I think these are the two big open questions. It's great that we end on the two big open questions: the consequences of the AI revolution, and can the great divergence effects be overcome in terms of converging levels of welfare and so on.
And historians never have the answers, of course.
No, by definition. That would be scary if we could have that kind of history. It would be very interesting. We would be much better paid if we could do that.
But we can, as you did today, we can inspire people to think about what could be possible.
I think that's the job.
Many thanks for this stimulating thoughts, and which certainly will inspire many of us in our research. And I wish you all a pleasant day or evening or night, wherever you are at the moment. And keep well, and see you on one of the later AIPRIL seminars on inequality. It was a great pleasure, and many thanks again to Walter and to all of you for being here. See you later.